Okay, so today we are going to cover some kind of foundational concepts about biological psychology that will kind of help us understand a lot of things, especially for the next several weeks of class. And so I will say today is very heavy on like neuroanatomy and things like that, which I remember at least a couple of you raising your hand whenever I asked if you were maybe a little bit intimidated or scared of that subject. And that tends to be the case. I've noticed in a lot of students that some of this can be maybe a little intimidating or scary to learn for some reason. And so I just want to say today's the most that you'll get of this, so don't let this like taint your view of the whole class going forward. But also, I don't have a ton of material to cover and we have a lot of time. So definitely feel free if you have any questions, if you're confused at any point, let me know. We can kind of slow down, talk about things from a different perspective, and help make sure that you understand all of this. So we're going to be, like I said, talking about neuroanatomy. We're going to talk, first of all, a little bit about kind of like large-scale anatomy, and then we'll kind of zoom in to talk about the cellular level, about individual neurons and their sort of function and their composition. So some of the main things I want you to take away from today, number one is that the nervous system has many parts, and all of those parts have very different functions. So if you haven't learned a lot about neuroanatomy in the past, you might kind of think of the brain as just like this single organ that's just kind of like a clump of cells doing stuff. But really it's split into all kinds of different little parts, and each of those parts basically has a different purpose or different function that it serves. Then, like I said, we'll zoom into talking about individual neurons. And individual neurons are pretty simple in their function. They do really simple things. They basically can be on or off. It's essentially, kind of how they function. And yet, when you put them together, they make these really complex patterns of activity that make up basically everything that you have ever experienced in your entire life. So kind of big picture thing, something I want you to think about just kind of in the back of your mind as I'm talking today, is that literally every thought you've ever had, every vision you've ever seen, everything you've ever smelled, every emotion you've ever felt, everything you're feeling right now or thinking right now is all just neurons firing in your brain, basically, is what it can be kind of reduced down to. And so we're going to start today sort of trying to understand how is that possible? How is it that something so simple can make, something so complex and amazing as our whole entire experience of life, basically. So that's maybe a little philosophical and big picture, but just kind of have that in the back of your mind today, and I would say even over the course of the next few weeks as we talk about some of these concepts. All right, so like I said, we're starting kind of at the larger level. The nervous system as a whole is split into two systems. You have what's called the central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord. And then everything else, any other nerve in your body, is going to be the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system are all these nerves that go mostly from the spine, and then they connect to like your vital organs, they connect to your muscles, to your skin. So central nervous system is brain and spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is everything else. And then we're going to zoom in a little bit on the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is further split. I'm kind of skipping a layer here, but there's technically the peripheral nervous system is split into the autonomic and the somatic system, but we're focusing on what's called the autonomic system, which basically controls kind of like automatic reactions to stimuli, essentially. And this part of the nervous system is split into two parts again. So we're kind of just like breaking up the nervous system in all these different parts. So you have what's called the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So how many of you ever heard of the fight or flight response? You heard that phrase before? Okay, so essentially the sympathetic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that activates that response. So typically we're going to have that fight or flight response anytime we're faced with something that is threatening in nature. So historically, kind of in our evolutionary past, that would have mostly been devoted to like escaping from predators. So if a bear or something approached, then this sympathetic nervous system would activate and basically prepare you to either run away from the bear or fight it, I guess, if you're really stupid and crazy. So it's kind of prepping you for all of that. So everything your sympathetic nervous system does is kind of serving that response. So for example, your sympathetic nervous system is going to increase your heart rate so that it's, your blood is pumping faster, you're getting oxygen to your muscles and to your brain so you can react. It's going to dilate your pupils so you can take in more light, so you can clearly see the bear's face as you punch it, I guess. So it's kind of increasing your visual ability a little bit. It's going to shut down digestion, and that's mostly so that, that blood and resources can be devoted to your muscles and other things. So sympathetic nervous system is basically just getting your body ready to respond to this threatening stimulus. Now, in modern times, we obviously don't really encounter predators anymore, and so sympathetic nervous system can be activated by other things that you can think of as like anxiety-provoking. So if you have test anxiety, for example, whenever you go to take an exam, your sympathetic nervous system is probably very active. So the opposite of the sympathetic nervous system is called the parasympathetic nervous system. And the parasympathetic nervous system decreases that level of arousal or alertness and basically relaxes your body. So it's going to do the opposite of everything I just said about the sympathetic nervous system. It's going to slow down your heart rate. It's going to constrict your pupils so you can kind of, things will be a little dimmer. You can kind of relax, get sleepy a little bit. It's going to increase digestion. So it does basically the opposite of what the sympathetic nervous system does. Now, at any given moment, you're going to have a little bit of activity from each of these. So you can kind of think of them almost as like the gas and the brakes. And at any moment, you're kind of maybe like riding both of those a little bit. So right now, you're maybe a little bit alert. You're trying to take notes. Maybe you feel slightly threatened by the material we're going to cover today because maybe, you're not super comfortable learning this stuff. Or maybe you're just like really awake even. So sympathetic nervous system isn't just about threat. It's also just what keeps you kind of like awake and alert. But you're also sitting in a chair, probably pretty comfortable. And so there's some activity from that parasympathetic nervous system as well. So again, those are all parts of the peripheral nervous system. So these are nerves that go from your spine to your vital organs, to your muscles, the control of those functions I just mentioned. Any questions so far? Okay. We won't talk a ton about the peripheral nervous system in this class. We will a little bit when we talk about like stress, for example, because when you're stressed out, you have lots of sympathetic activity, and that can have all kinds of issues long term. But other than that, we will mostly spend our time focusing on the central nervous system. So again, remember the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord, and we're going to focus mostly on the brain. So today I'm giving you just very basic kind of large-scale structures. Just know that there are, probably hundreds of structures in the brain. We're definitely not going to talk about all of them. There's also lots of different ways to kind of map these different parts of the brain. So you can kind of think of it like, I could have a map of the United States, and I could map it based on the state borders, like break it up between, Washington, Oregon, whatever. Or I could have a map of the U.S. that's broken up more like geographically, where we have like the plains in the middle, and we have, the different mountains on the coast or whatever. So kind of the same way with the brain, there's different systems or different methods for mapping it, kind of depending on what field you're coming from, what the purpose is, etc. So we're just kind of looking at really large-scale structures today. So one of the first things to know about the brain is that it's made up of layers. I kind of like to think of it almost like an onion, like you have a very inner layer, and then there's things built up on top of that. And in general, the more inner layers of the brain are going to focus on more automatic processes, and then as you get out to the outer layers, those are going to be the more like controlled, conscious things that we consciously think of and have control over, basically. So the most inner layer of the brain is called the brainstem. Brainstem sits basically right on top of the spinal cord. It's kind of just an extension of the spinal cord. And your brainstem controls things like your heart rate and your breathing. So, most of the time, maybe because I just mentioned your heart rate and your breathing, you might become consciously aware of it. You definitely can control your breathing, obviously. Some people can maybe control their heart rate a little bit. But in general, those are very automatic things that are happening in the background. You don't have to think about it. It's not like you have to constantly sit there and think like, okay, heart, beat now, beat now, beat now, right? It's just happening all the time. What do you think would happen if you had damage to your brainstem? Yes, you would die. So if you have damage to your brainstem, you're going to die because your breathing and your heart rate or your heartbeat are going to stop. So that's the most inner layer, super automatic stuff that we never ever think about, totally unconscious. Then as you build up to the layers out of that, like I said, it gets more controlled and more conscious. Sort of wrapping around, we'll talk more about this later, so don't worry too much about this detail right now, but just to give you an example, one of the structures that kind of wraps around sort of the middle layer is called the limbic system, and the limbic system is mostly important for like emotions. So if you think about emotions, they're kind of, I would say, in the middle of like automatic and controlled. Like emotions, we often have a very automatic emotional reaction to something, but it's also something that we can control to a pretty large degree. We can kind of tamp down our emotions or play them up. We can regulate the way that we express them. So the limbic system's kind of in the middle. And then the outer layer is what's called the cortex. And if you just like think of a brain, if I told you to draw a brain, probably what you would draw would look something like the cortex. The cortex is the kind of wrinkly outer structure that wraps around the entire rest of the brain. And so in these pictures, you can mostly see the cortex. And cortex is basically the home of all of our conscious experiences and thoughts. So right now, you can very consciously see the screen. You're having all these thoughts about hopefully what I'm saying, but maybe you're also thinking about, like, I don't know, what you had for breakfast this morning or what you're going to do after class. All of those conscious thoughts exist in the cortex. They're from activity in the cortex, basically. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? So the cortex is split into 4 different lobes. So those are mapped here in this bottom picture. The occipital lobe at the very back of the brain is mostly responsible for visual input or visual control. So, you know, in your eyes, at the very back of your eye, you have what's called the retina. The retina sends its neurons all the way to the very back of the brain, and then the back of the brain processes all that information that's coming in and helps you see, basically. So that's the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe, so that's the one right in front of the occipital lobe. It's kind of close to your temple. That's how I always remember the name of it. And the temporal lobe mostly processes auditory information, including language. So, you know, you're sitting here listening to my voice right now. For you to process what I'm saying and understand it, make meaning out of it, that's all happening in the temporal lobe. The parietal lobe, that's the one in blue, that's kind of above the temporal lobe in front of the occipital lobe. That controls mostly what's called somatosensory information. So that's like the sensations that you feel from your skin, and also controls like the movement of your muscles. So your motor information as well. And then the frontal lobe, obviously at the very front of the brain, that controls really higher order, things like decision-making, judgment, self-regulation. A lot of aspects of our personality are kind of controlled by the frontal lobe. So the cortex split into those 4 different lobes. And then in addition to that, the brain is split into 2 hemispheres, including the cortex. Almost all of the structures in the brain are split in 2. There's some in the very middle that are not necessarily, but most of the brain is kind of split into 2 hemispheres. And those 2 hemispheres also serve very different purposes as well. So both hemispheres are going to have all 4 of the lobes I just mentioned. Both hemispheres are going to have a frontal lobe, a temporal lobe, a parietal lobe, an occipital lobe, etc. But they're going to kind of process things in different ways. So most of the things we think of about language actually happen in the left side of the brain. So for you to understand the meaning of language, the rules of grammar, all of that is happening mostly in the left side of the brain. The right side of the brain contributes a little bit to language, but it's mostly going to be things like the rhythm of your speech and what's called prosody. Prosody is like how your speech kind of flows, like you might, you know, sort of raise your voice a little bit at the end if you're asking a question. So things like that, like rhythm and prosody, are in the right side of the brain. So again, main thing to take from that for the 2 hemispheres is just you have the right and the left, and they control different things. What else do I want to say about the cortex? Maybe the last thing I'll mention about the cortex, again, kind of like higher level, maybe philosophical a little bit, just to think about in the background. The cortex, like I said, is the most outer structure. It's kind of wrapping around the brain. I kind of think of it almost like a sheet on a mattress. It's like pretty thin compared to the rest of the brain. And like I said, the cortex is where all your conscious thought is happening. Everything below the cortex, all of those neurons that are packed below it, are mostly unconscious things. They're things we're not aware of. So one of the things I want you to think about throughout this quarter is that most of the processing that's happening in your nervous system, you don't have any conscious access or awareness of what's going on. It's only when that information makes its way to this last layer of the cortex that you become consciously aware of what's actually happening. So a lot of the things that we think we have control over, we maybe don't necessarily have as much control as we think, because it's mostly just neurons in our brain kind of responding to whatever's happening in the environment, and then eventually that activity gets to the cortex, and your cortex basically tells you a story to try to make sense of what's happening, and to try to justify your behaviors and your reactions and all these things. So kind of a concept we'll come back to throughout the quarter. Okay, so for now, that's all we're going to say about kind of these larger structures. Throughout the quarter, I'll talk about other structures that we didn't cover here just whenever they become relevant. So like when we talk about emotion, I'll talk more about the limbic system. When we talk about learning and memory, I'll talk about the structures that are important for that. When we talk about personality, I'll talk about the structures that are important for that. So this will come up a little bit, again, throughout the quarter, but these are kind of just like big picture structures I want you to know for now. Any questions about that so far before we kind of zoom in and talk about individual cells? Okay. All right, so then let's do that. Let's zoom in and talk about these individual cells of the nervous system. So I'll give you kind of another, I like to talk in metaphors a lot, if you haven't noticed. I think it kind of helps give you just a little bit of grounding of like what this stuff means if you haven't thought about it before. So for the cells, curious, how many of you have ever played the game Minecraft? Okay, quite a few of you. For those of you who have played, have you ever messed around with like the redstone system? Does anybody know what that is? Okay, so I'll kind of describe it for those of you who've maybe never played or don't mess with it. So in Minecraft, it's kind of this open world game where you can just like break things, craft things, make whatever out of the world basically. One of the systems in it is called redstone, which is kind of like electrical circuits. So you have this redstone, it's like a powder that you can lay down on the ground or wherever you want, and it makes sort of almost like wires. And then you can connect that redstone dust to all kinds of things. So there's like torches that'll turn it on or off. There's like a pressure plate. If you step on it, it'll sense that and turn on the redstone. There's like a daylight sensor. If you put that somewhere in the world and the light, it's bright out, it'll activate that and turn it on. And so you can make all these like crazy contraptions in Minecraft with redstone. So you can put together all these simple little pieces and make something like a door that opens automatically. Like you're walking, you step on a pressure plate, and then it activates something that makes a door open so you can just walk through it. You can automate whole like farming systems. There's all kinds of crazy stuff you can do with Minecraft redstone. For those of you who've seen it, do you have any examples of like really extreme crazy contraptions you've seen? Anybody?
Yeah, an elevator.
An elevator, that's another one I've seen. Yeah, I've seen a couple different iterations of an elevator. The one I've seen is kind of like a zipper thing, where it's like you step on something and then all these blocks sort of zip up and like carry you up somewhere. I've seen other versions of the elevator too, though. But yeah, so the point is, though, you have all these very simple blocks that basically can be either on or off. You put them together and you make these really complex, crazy contraptions. So why do you think I'm talking about Minecraft in the context of cells, of the nervous system? Anybody? Yes?
Because cells are like the blocks and they all come together and do stuff?
Exactly, yeah. So each individual neuron would be kind of like a redstone torch or a daylight sensor or even like the redstone powder. But if you put a bunch of neurons together in really specific patterns, then you get really complex behaviors and activities. You get a body that can react to light and can react to pressure and react to sound and all these different things. So the cells themselves, very simple, but we put them together and we get this really complex system, this complex behavior. So the cells of the nervous system, the neurons, are in some ways like other cells in your body. So one of the ways that they're like the cells in your body is that they have what's called a soma. The soma is essentially the cell body. It's kind of like in the middle of this big cluster. So this part here would be the soma. And the soma is where the nucleus lives. So that's where you have like the DNA. If you think back to biology, all the things you learned about cells, like mitochondria, Golgi complexes or whatever, all that stuff, that's all in the soma of the neuron. So the soma, very similar to other cells in your body. But the way that the neurons are different is that they're really sort of built to process information. They're built to receive information, maybe do a little bit of stuff with that information, and then send it along to another neuron in the chain. And so they also have these structures called dendrites. So dendrites are these sort of branch-like structures that kind of span out around the soma. And the dendrite's main job is to receive information. Usually it's going to be receiving information from other neurons. So another neuron before it will kind of spit out some chemicals. Those chemicals will bind on the dendrite. It'll receive that information, it'll process it, and then send it along. So usually it's coming from other neurons. Sometimes, though, that information might be coming from the environment. So like there's neurons in my skin, and they have dendrites that kind of like innervate my skin. And whenever I press, or if I itch, or if I poke, or whatever, it's basically activating those dendrites. So those dendrites are receiving the information from the environment. They're receiving the pressure that I'm placing on my skin. So dendrites receive the information, and then they send that to the axon. The axon is this long tail that comes out of the neuron, and the axon sends the information. And it sends it as an electrical impulse. So it's basically just electricity that flows through the axon, kind of like a wire, and then eventually makes its way to the end of the axon, which is called the terminal buttons. And we'll talk in a second about what happens after that information gets to the terminal buttons. Some neurons have what's called myelin, and myelin is kind of pictured in that like bluish-white color there, and it wraps around the axon, and it basically insulates the axon. So it's kind of like, like rubber coating on a wire or something like that. So it insulates it, which helps keep all that electricity kind of contained within the axon, and it also helps speed up that electrical impulse. So it makes it so the neuron can send its messages faster. Not all neurons have myelin. The ones that do not have myelin are going to be slower than the ones that do have myelin. There's also a lot of, this is kind of the typical picture. If you look at any textbook, you'll see a picture of a neuron that looks kind of like this. But just know that there are actually, thousands of different kinds of neurons that all look very different from each other. So you can have some neurons that don't really have an axon. They're just kind of like a circular blob that maybe have a bunch of dendrites. You can have some neurons that have really complex dendrites that are like really elaborate sort of branching structures, way more elaborate than what's pictured here. So there's all kinds of differences you can see in neurons, just kind of depending on where they are in the brain, what function they serve, etc. Okay, so like I said, dendrites receive the information, it turns into an electrical impulse that goes down the axon and eventually makes its way to the end, to those terminal buttons down at the end of the axon. Here we're zooming in to the end of the axon. So this little nub here would be like one of those terminal buttons from the previous image. So this would be the end of an axon of neuron 1. And then this little nub is a dendrite of neuron 2. So this is where neuron 1 and neuron 2 are connecting. And that connection is called the synapse. So the synapse is where neurons communicate with each other. And there's this really complex sort of pattern of things that happen chemically within the cell. So whenever the electrical impulse from the axon gets to the end, it causes the synapse to spill out a bunch of chemicals that are called neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters is sort of this broad class of chemicals that are in your nervous system. They're kind of like hormones a little bit in a lot of ways. There's probably, hundreds of different neurotransmitters. We'll talk about a few of them in this class. So for example, dopamine. A lot of you have probably heard of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that's found in a particular area of the brain that's really important for like learning and reward and pleasure, things like that. So we'll talk about dopamine later, but that's just an example of a neurotransmitter. Again, there's like hundreds of them. So anyways, the electrical impulse reaches the end of the axon. It causes these neurotransmitters to spill out into the synapse. So now you have all these little chemicals floating around in the synapse. And neuron number 2, on its dendrite, it has these things called receptors. And the receptors are kind of like a lock on a door. And the neurotransmitter is basically like a key. So the neurotransmitter spills out into the synapse and it binds to the receptor. And in a lot of cases, it'll then cause that door to open. And once the door opens, it basically causes neuron number 2 to activate or to fire. So you got neuron number 1, electrical impulse comes down, neurotransmitter spills out, binds into the receptor, opens it up, which allows then neuron number 2 to fire. And so at any given moment, again, right now for you to just like see the screen and read the words, there's just a chain, there's, photons of light that hit your retina, and that activates some neurons in your retina. And then those neurons send that information to the next neuron in the chain, and then the next neuron in the chain. Eventually all that makes its way back to your occipital lobe, to your cortex, which then gets all that information, processes it, and tells you, hey, there's a screen up there that says the synapse, and it's white, and there's a green picture, and it's got blue blobs in the middle, and your brain sort of interprets all of that just from this thing happening over and over again. These neurons firing each other over and over. Now, I will say I am massively oversimplifying this process, just because this is a 100 level class, and a lot of you might not have learned this stuff before, and I don't want to overwhelm you with complications. But I'll tell you some of those complications now, just so you kind of know like what level of simplification you're doing. So one thing to keep in mind is that, I talked about these neurotransmitters binding, opening a lock, and then activating another neuron. Sometimes these neurotransmitters, though, can be what's called inhibitory. So an inhibitory neurotransmitter, instead of being like a key in a lock, it's more like if I went and put like gum or clay or something in all the locks around campus and like gunked them up so that nobody can put a key in there, nobody can unlock it and open it. So some neurotransmitters will block those receptors. So instead of opening the door and activating it, it's making it so that they cannot be activated. So it's inhibiting the next neuron. Okay. And then, another complication, like I said, there's hundreds of these different neurotransmitters. All of them do different things. So some of them might bind to the receptor and excite it. Some of them might bind to the receptor and inhibit it. Some of them might bind to the receptor and then do a whole complex, like domino reaction within the cell that causes something else to happen that's not even about activating or inhibiting the cell. There's also different kinds of receptors for every neurotransmitter. So there's hundreds of neurotransmitters, and for each neurotransmitter, there's maybe like 20 different receptors that it can bind to. And depending on which receptor it binds to, it's going to do all kinds of different things.
Would
Right.
that be bipolar then? From all that going around not making sense.
Would it
Because
be?
it's being blocked. I'm just trying to figure out what is, if it's being blocked,
Right.
then I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out.
It's
what's
essentially, so
blocking
let me give
it.
you an example that might help you make sense of it. So if I'm going to extend my arm, I would have to think about it. I'm activating my tricep and relaxing my bicep at the same time in order to do that. So there's like a circuit of neurons that actually will, whenever I send a command to my arm to do that, it'll activate the tricep, so it's like the lock opening, but it'll stop my bicep. So it'll inhibit all the muscles in my bicep using that like blocking method. So that way I can extend my arm effectively. Because if they were both excited at the same time, I would just kind of like spasm and not be able to move my arm.
Okay.
So that inhibition is actually really necessary for a lot of the functioning of everything in your nervous system. Yeah. Leah, did you have a question?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I'm kind of like relating it to, like when you learn about someone that like has a drug addiction
Mhm.
and their receptors start to like close off.
Yes.
Because it's so much dopamine being passed through that the receptors start to not work. Is that what you're talking about, like with the clay or whatever?
It's similar. That's a different mechanism. That's kind of another layer of complication.
Mm.
And we'll actually talk about that in quite a bit of detail when we get to addiction.
Okay.
So maybe kind of like put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it in a few weeks when we talk about addiction. Yeah. These are all great questions and observations, though. Any others? But yeah, so what I just described, the whole inhibition thing, that's actually very important in your nervous system. I mean, kind of another thing I can think about, if you think of like, at any given moment, you might have thoughts that are like surfacing in your brain, and you have to make choices about what you're going to say out loud and what you're going to withhold, right? And a lot of that has to do with inhibition in the brain. Like if I have a thought of something like, okay, it'd be maybe inappropriate to say that, or it's not the right time to say it, There's actually inhibition that's shutting down those neurons in my brain that want to say, or whatever it is that I'm thinking. Does that make sense? So that inhibition is actually, really important. It's not a bad thing. I maybe made it sound like a bad thing with my metaphor of gunking up a lock, but it's actually very healthy and productive in a lot of cases. Okay. I think that was all I had to say about the synapse, and that is my last slide. Are there any other questions about the nervous system? Yeah, Mia.
How important are the diagrams? Like, should I be like drawing little tiny diagrams in my notes?
That's a good question. The quizzes will help you kind of gauge that. So I will tell you, I think our quiz next week, will have the picture of the neuron. So the picture of the neuron where it labels like the soma, the dendrites, the axon, and the myelin, that will be on the quiz next week.
And we're
So
supposed to be able to label them?
yeah, so basically if you have that picture, could you label where the soma is and where the dendrites are and where the axon is? Yep. Yes,
Do you
Olivia.
post these slideshows in the classroom, like on Canvas?
Yes, yeah, all the PowerPoints are on Canvas, and then like I said, I'm recording the lectures, and I will post a YouTube link to those. I meant to do it on Friday, and then it just escaped my brain, didn't happen. So there will be a YouTube playlist posted. I'm probably gonna work on this right after class today. So after class today, there will be a YouTube playlist. There will just be a link to it, and it'll have all the recordings from last week, and then I'll post today's probably later, sometime today. But yeah, those will be updated regularly. Any other questions? Okay. We're done very early.